Welcome into Mock Trial Masterclass, your guide to controlling the courtroom. I'm Luke, and I want you to be a mock trial master. And in this episode of the Mock Trial Masterclass Podcast, we're going to talk about how you can do just that. The Mock Trial Masterclass Podcast comes out on the first Friday of every month, and the only goal I have with this podcast, it's not about hearing myself talk or showing off what I know or what anyone else knows. There's one goal with this, and that is getting you better, helping you reach your potential, because I know you have it in you to be a mock trial master. You just need the tools. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to give you some of those tools. It's February, which means everyone is heating up in their tournament preparation, whether you are in high school or college. Regional competitions are right around the corner, and that means a lot of people want to know how to practice well, how to prepare the right way. And so what we're going to do on this episode of the Mock Trial Masterclass Podcast is talk about just that. And joining me is someone who knows how to prepare for mock trial competitions as well as anyone. And she's going to help us go over how to prepare your case, how to make the most out of your practice time, and how you as an individual can get better outside of practice time. It's two-time All-American attorney Liz Grant. Welcome into the Mock Trial Masterclass Podcast.
Hi, Luke. Happy to be here.
Liz, you graduated from Stanford back in May, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how many years before that had you competed in mock trial in a row?
Oh my gosh, I think 8 years. I did mock trial in high school for 4 years and then 4 again in college. So almost a decade.
How weird is it to not, because you're coaching now at Maryland, but you're not competing. What's the difference there? How weird is that?
It's bizarre. I think I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I do.
Yeah.
It's hard to take a step away from the competitive side, as I'm sure you also feel, Luke, but
yeah,
it's great. Teaching is great. Coaching is great. And it feels good when they win.
Well, let's talk about how to make that happen, because there's a ton of stuff I want to get into today. And the first thing I want to talk about is preparing your case, because that's really the first part about all of this. You can be a master at objections and a master at speaking and know the fundamentals of all of this, but if you don't have a handle on the case itself that you're dealing with, on the actual problem, a lot of it goes for naught. So my first question for you is, when you get a case, and in your competing career, when you got a case, whether that was high school or college, what's the first thing you do? What's the first thing you dive into when you get that notification, the case is out, you open the PDF, what comes first?
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is to understand the law, not necessarily super in depth, but to understand what is the actual problem here that we're trying to solve, whether that's in high school, usually criminal charges, and in college, whether that's civil or criminal. But you want to understand both from the offensive and defensive side what exactly it is you're trying to wrap your head around and why the facts matter. And I think starting with the law is the best place to do that.
And as you're going through the case, you mentioned getting a handle on both sides. That is so important, and I think that's new to a lot of people who are doing this for the first time, not just making my argument on one side of the case and seeing which side I believe in more or something like that, especially if you're going to be double-sided, but even if you're not, it's very important to have that grasp of both sides.
That's definitely true. And I think it's really hard the first time you read a case to read for both sides at the same time. I would read it twice. First, to look for the prosecution or plaintiff facts, and second, for the defense facts. And whenever you start to feel comfortable with the people that are involved, maybe some of the stipulations or exhibits, making tables for each of the witnesses that exist to try to say, well, how much is on the prosecution or plaintiff side and how much is on the defense side, just so you can understand what you want to pick from.
See, what I like to do, it's so fun that everyone has sort of their different approach, their different strategy. I have always, and I still do this, I will go through and I'll read the witness statement, and I'll have a yellow highlighter in one hand and a pink highlighter in the other, and I highlight facts for with the yellow and facts against with the pink, And what winds up happening is then as you go down the road and go to start writing directs and crosses, the facts tend to be sort of right there for you. And it's huge to get that foundation early on, like you were talking about.
Yeah, that's true. And I think with some of the more complicated cases, sometimes you find facts that apply to both sides, which can
Yeah.
be really crazy.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of neutral facts, distracting facts, random information that the case writers have put in there. And sometimes it's helpful to go through with a third color and mark what may or may not be
Yeah.
useful or what you don't know, terms that you're unfamiliar with, or you're not sure how it will fit into the big picture yet, but you want to finish reading the whole packet first before you decide, just to remember to come back. But I definitely agree. The multicolored highlighters have saved me a lot.
And there's something really important I think you were hinting at there with, asking questions, highlighting what you don't know, coming back to that later. And that's that as you read these things, you have to think critically about them, right? It's not just taking everything at face value and saying, okay, we've got this witness, he has this good fact for my side, but he's like legally blind, and so can we really believe him? Like, you got to get way deeper than that and ask questions the whole time of everything you're looking at.
Absolutely. And sometimes you even want to ask yourself, why did the case writer put that in there for me to find?
Yeah.
Did they intend for it to be distracting to me? Did they intend for me to use this? Because a lot of the time, trying to figure out why they put information in there can help guide you on what you want to do with it.
So I think something that every team wrestles with, every competitor, every coach, is finding the balance between, because you don't always have a whole lot of time with a case, especially if you're preparing for nationals. You've got probably a month and a half, and in a lot of high school areas, it's not like college where you have the whole fall. You've really only got a couple of months, and that's balancing. Okay, we need to get on the same page with what this case is and what our theory is for what happened on both sides, and then at a certain point, we got to start writing material, and we've got to start getting a handle on what we're actually going to say. So how important is it, I guess, or is it not as important to get a full handle on the theory before you start writing material? What's sort of the balance there in your mind?
I think really sort of both sides have an argument that could be made there, where it's really nice to have a full handle on the facts before you go to write everything down on the page. But I'm a much messier thinker. And
Yeah.
I think especially as you start out, that can tend to be the case. And sometimes it's a lot better to get ideas down on a piece of paper, to start writing it out, and then to come back a day later and say, you know what, this isn't working. We really wanted to make this point come across, but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Is this really what even the case packet is saying? And to then kind of do layers upon layers of messy edits on the actual page. But if it helps you to reverse engineer that, you should try different things,
I like what you said there about really emphasizing at a certain point, right, you got to get things on paper. And I think this is something that for me, as I stepped away from competing and into coaching, was something that I started to shift on, because I remember when I started scoring competitions, I made this realization, which is, and I tell my team this all the time, especially if it's a criminal case, no one's going to jail, right? No one is actually going to jail at the end of this. The 1 to 10 scores that you are being given are based on your performance. And as a scorer, especially if I've never heard this case before, I'm probably not going to notice if your case theory isn't fully baked. If you're out there giving exceptional speeches and exceptional crosses that are persuasive and letting you shine as the individual.
Yeah, and I think both in the high school and college scorer pools, because I've coached for both, there tends to be a lot of lawyers who have volunteered a day of their time. They've never read the case packet. They may not have ever tried a case with the actual charge or law that you're working with. And most of the time, they don't notice small nitpicks in the case. They notice the big problems. If you can eliminate those really early on, I think it's a big advantage, especially come tournament time.
On that note, just real quick, I didn't even plan to talk about this, but I want your thoughts. Do you think, because every coach tells their team that this happens, do scorers notice gender issues as much as we think they do? Like when you're closing and the defendant was clearly a him and you call him a her because on your team the defendant is a her and that's who you practiced with?
I think it's not so much that they notice those errors, but that those errors can contribute to confusion. So it's not so much that they notice that there's misgendering in a statement, but that they might get confused about who you're actually talking about. I think for the most part, as long as you don't, make it really clear that you screwed up, and you just keep talking, people usually don't notice that you messed up at all. And they're certainly not going to notice that it's, not what you wrote down on your speech. They have no idea.
Yeah.
So as long as you keep going, they won't notice.
My last year competing, I have a funny story about this. It was the Genesis Petrillo wedding poisoning case.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm opening and I'm telling this very dramatic story about this bride who picked out the perfect dress and she's got her bridesmaids by her side and it's this lovely thing. And I planned this great opening and my coaches are like, "Oh yes, Luke, this is fabulous. I can't wait to hear you give it." And then we get into the tournament and the other side's like, "Oh, by the way, our Genesis is a dude." And I'm like, I don't know why the thought had never crossed my mind that now I can't get up and talk about the bridesmaids and the dresses and all of that. And I if I remember right, the first time I did it the original way, not even thinking about it. But to your point, just kind of played it off, and because it was so early, no one really even noticed. But that's a good point about the confusion. I had never really thought about it that way.
Yeah, I think as long as you can keep people as less confused as possible, that's probably for the best. But even with that example, you could always change the perspective to be talking about how the man is so excited that his bride is going to be able to experience those things,
Yes,
right? And
yeah,
she's in the
yeah.
dress and she's waiting for the bridesmaids. And so there you go. All you have to do is change a couple verbs in there and you're good to go. The speech is perfect as is.
And that wound up being a very difficult opening even without that, because there were so many, and this is why I even say in opening, use names as much as possible as opposed to he, she, because there were so many of them, and it was hard for me even to remember on my own team who was who. Speaking of opening and case theory, such a huge part of that is getting your theme right. If you're not familiar and you're new to this whole mock trial theme, a theme is basically a slogan. I think Papa John saying, better ingredients, better pizza, something catchy that sticks in your head, that gets you to remember the heart of the case. I think getting the theme right, Liz, is one of the hardest parts of this thing we do. What's your approach to that? I mean, is it just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks? Do you have a process that you go to?
Picking a theme is a really difficult thing to do. I think you hit the nail on the head there. And any process that you make to try to find a theme is going to feel like nails on a chalkboard, because when you find something that fits, you know that it fits. And when it doesn't, that's pretty obvious too. I think in general, I like to pick a side and just start writing down what I think the case is actually about.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking about a wedding poisoning, I like to think about motive. Why did they commit this poisoning? Was it for money? Was it for, an emotional family reason? And then you can start playing with those sorts of very general, broad concepts, which I think is a lot easier to distill down than specifics, and say, profits over people, right? There's a money theme with motive right in there. You're not going to get it right the first time. I've probably written down, 30, 40 themes per case I've tried and have picked one out of the pile that I thought was best, but you definitely have to experiment with it.
And as you're coming up with these things, is there a sort of filter you run it through? Is there something that in your mind makes a theme a good theme versus a bad one? Because I feel like we all kind of know when we go into a competition and we hear another team's speech and it's clear that maybe they don't have the same access to fundamentals and that sort of thing, and we think, gee, that wasn't a very good theme. What is it that I guess separates the two? Because you know it when you hear it, right?
Absolutely. And there are some telltale characteristics that can really, if they're baked into your theme, generally, it's a good theme. I think they should be short. they should be about your theory, right? We don't want it to be off the walls, really generic.
Yeah.
We want it to be sometimes alliterative or rhyme, right?
Mm-hmm.
Profits over people. Again, there's two P's. It sounds really catchy, very short,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
great. I think you want to sometimes avoid quotes from historical figures,
Yes.
or really long themes that are maybe not as connected to the actual case or the actual people. To the extent that your theme has a person in it, you want to use their name or the defendant or the officer, so that you don't get into a situation where, again, you've mispronounced, you've used the wrong pronouns for someone.
Yeah.
So as specific as you can get and as short and clear as you can get, I think that really helps make it catchy.
Last thing on themes before we move on. How do you feel? Because I find that a lot of people have varying opinions on this, about the sort of classic, I step out to do my opening statement, and the first words out of my mouth are, my theme, and then I go into the statement. I personally go back and forth on that. As a writer, it is obviously not natural, and you would want the theme to come out more naturally. But there have been rounds where you get to the end and you look at the score sheet, and even though you made your theme clear, you get comments like, "Oh, I love your theme. It was this, and it definitely was not that." And so saying it right off the bat makes it abundantly clear what your theme is. Where do you stand on that?
I think ultimately it's just got to be in the first 30 seconds, and you have to make it clear when it is in that first 30 seconds. So if it's at the end of that piece of time, big pause before you say it. And if it's the first thing you say, big pause after it before you carry on. Everybody essentially zones out after the first 30 seconds. So you want to make sure it's in there somewhere.
But before we move on to talking about practicing, there's one more thing when it comes to case prep that I want to get into. And that is something that it is mind-boggling to me that no one can seem to nail this down, and yet we're going to try to do that in just a couple of minutes of time. The fact that the American Mock Trial Association has had to form a committee to talk about unfair extrapolation, what is and what isn't, is so bizarre to me. A couple of years ago, I was coaching a high school team at Nationals, and as a part of our coaches meeting, there was a treatise from the tournament director on what is and is not unfair extrapolation. For whatever reason, we've got a lot of smart minds in this mock trial world. No one can seem to nail down exactly what is and is not this. So instead of asking you to, tell us the difference and what technically is and isn't an unfair extrapolation, I'll ask it this way. As you're preparing a case, and specifically preparing directs as you're trying to add some flair to your witnesses, how far to you is too far as you're in prep mode?
That's a really difficult question. More broadly, I do think if you're going to test those waters, I would do it before the AMTA tournaments or your county or state tournaments if you're in high school, because those are the tournaments where if you make a mistake, right, there's going to be a big problem, and you may get into trouble, you may get sanctions, things like that. And if you test it at tournaments, you can kind of see, how big those inventions impact the actual trial. Are there impeachments on your witnesses? Do those kinds of big moments happen? But in terms of drafting, I really prefer to keep those things out of there as much as I can, just because when the danger is so high, I find it hard to explain that there's more value in the risk. There's more risk than reward there. So I try to keep it out, but I think you can always push the needle on things like a witness's general background, what they do for a living, those sorts of areas. But you don't want to invent on, like you said, unfair extrapolations or material inventions. So the question then becomes, how important is it?
And we could do a whole episode just talking about this one issue because there are so many layers. I know at the high school level, especially at the early stages of the year, you'll get these teams where their whole strategy is just to object and say, objection, this is outside the universe. This is an unfair extrapolation. And, half the time the judge will agree with them, even if it's exactly what you were just talking about, background. But I tend to agree to stay away because no one likes the people who wade those ethical waters of I mean, there's a big latitude. There's a big latitude between Yale and the 2019 national championship and what you were just talking about, adding some character to the witness. But everywhere in between that is so muddy.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And I think you're right. There is sort of a cultural taboo on it, especially in college mock trial at the moment. And a lot of, networking really matters in terms of, whether or not you can set up scrimmages, whether or not you can go to certain tournaments.
Yeah.
So it's nice to be on the safe side, I think.
That's a great idea, trying it out before a scrimmage. I had never really processed it that way, but that does make a lot of sense to see how far you can push the envelope. Let's talk about practice. And I'll start by asking you this. You're a coach now. You competed for 8 years. Is there, in your eyes, an ideal rhythm for practice? If I'm a coach or if I'm a competitor and I'm trying to figure out what's best for my team, not necessarily does it need to be Monday or Thursday or Wednesday or anything like that, but what does the ideal practice week look like for a successful team?
That's a really hard question. And I think it varies on team and competitor experience to a certain degree. I rest more on the side of you don't need to over practice. And sometimes that can result in students feeling unmotivated or they don't want to do extra work outside of practice that might be really useful.
Yeah.
So I think, 2-3 times a week when you have a scrimmage or a tournament coming up, more if necessary, to make sure that everything's prepped. But I like to think too about the fact that everyone's a student and that academics really should come first, and mock trial is a supplement to a really rich academic career, whether you're in high school or college. So I don't like to over practice, I suppose, is my very vague answer to you, Luke.
And so following up on that, you mentioned you don't want people to get burned out. I feel like as a coach and even as a competitor looking at your teammates, you will always have the type of people like the two of us who are totally fired up about this, the kind of people who are listening to this podcast. And then you'll have those who are maybe doing it for the resume, but they're very talented at it, or they're just kind of enjoying it and hanging out with their friends, but you keep them on the team because, again, they're good at it. You want them there. How do you strike that balance in, I guess, keeping both parties engaged and interested and keeping the people like us feeling stimulated and not keeping the others from feeling overstimulated?
Yeah, I think anyone who wants more work should have more work.
Yeah.
And so much of that work at the beginning is writing. All of it's writing. And I think that's especially true in college mock trial, because now there are so many more swing witnesses than it feels like there were, 4 or 5 years ago. Now there's 10 crosses to write on both sides. And with so many theories that the defense and plaintiff could run, the crosses are 10 pages with the conditional pockets that you could add to each of these crosses to make sure you're prepared for it. There's objection prep work, right? Attorneys and witnesses can go into the documents and mark, hey, I think we might have a speculation problem here, or hey, I think this might be hearsay. And then we can have other discussions about it. And I think for people who are busier, who may be more stepped away from mock trial, I tend to like to focus on actual performance for those folks, to really get in a room and dig into the moment where they're performing the material to refine it. And hopefully somebody wants to write the material because it's got to get written.
Yeah. And with that, one of the lawyers I coach with likes to talk about how with mock trial practice, you ultimately reach a point of diminishing returns. That always comes up for us around tournament time when the kids will want to practice every day and, we got a tournament, let's get ready. And at a certain point, it's like, it doesn't matter how many times you do this, how many more times you do this direct, it's going to sound whatever it is right now. How do you, I guess, become aware when you've reached that point, maybe as a competitor, and how much is too much?
Really just as a competitor for myself, and I'd be curious to know how you feel about this too, Luke, is I was really pumped before the tournaments, but it was really important for me to sleep that actual weekend and the days leading up to it. So I would try to study as much as possible the week before the tournament, and then the actual week of, just make sure I had my memorization down and did a couple of reps of the things, but mostly I would try to rest.
Yeah. That's a good point. And I'm glad I'm not the only one who did like weird things that you would expect athletes to do before a tournament, like getting the rest. I used to, and I didn't do this in college because I was like, who cares at this point? But in high school, I was much more wound up about it all, and I would like go on vocal rest like Thursday and Friday because I'm like, Saturday morning when this tournament starts, I need to have my full voice, and if I don't, I'm letting my team down. Maybe not quite go that far. I think that might be the point of going too far. When you're practicing leading up to a tournament, how do you balance the need to scrimmage live, whether that's an internal scrimmage if you've got two teams, or even if you've just got one team, having a full scrimmage, but maybe people bouncing back and forth from the sides they're on, or scrimmaging another team versus picking apart individual stuff and say, okay, well, let's take these two folks and we're going to go work on the cross of Dr. Smith or whoever. How do you balance the need for each of those things?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a lot of overlap in what those two sort of different, practice tactics result in. But for me, they're very different in the sense that if you're not scrimmaging, if you're not testing the material, you're getting what is essentially a base run. What does this look like when it's perfect, when it's not objected to, when we're not doing anything that's improvised in this exam in our ideal world? And once I think that is pretty down, and you don't have to have it perfect really in any sense, because you never will once the material starts getting poked at a tournament. But then start adding in the scrimmages and even practices where your teammates are objecting to it. And, flip a coin on the objections. Crazy things happen at tournaments. It's not predictable at all. But once I think you're ready to be improvising and to test student ability to make really quick decisions and changes and new objection arguments, that's really when to press the scrimmages and the tournament work, if that makes sense.
I love the coin flip idea, because something that I've always encountered is when you scrimmage your teammates, again, whether you've got two teams or whether you're just flipping around, whether you have the same material or not, the material that's coming. If I'm a witness, I know every question I'm about to get asked. If I'm an attorney on one side, I know exactly where this direct is heading. I've objected 4 questions ahead in my mind. They've responded 4 questions ahead in their mind. So really, I like the idea of flipping a coin, or really anything to keep you out of that flow and let you get some practice thinking off the cuff and reacting in real time.
Definitely. And it's hard to actually be able to predict those kinds of things. You find a lot of the time that attorneys or even mock trial alumni who are judging you don't know the rules of evidence, or, really dislike people. Bias is a really big factor in a lot of judge and score results. And I think as randomized as you can keep it as a coach, the more on your toes you are as a competitor. And I got bored a lot as a competitor, just doing the same crosses with my same teammates 15, 16 times before a tournament. Because you're right, I know what they're going to say. So it's nice sometimes to, if you play one witness, step in to play a different witness real quick to see how the answers change just with a different individual giving you different answers. I think even if it's not the witness you play, it helps you respond to different cross styles too from different attorneys, and can be really fun.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Anything to aid in having to think off the cuff. Before we get into our last topic, I want to remind everyone that you can schedule coaching with me, and you're thinking, oh, just the two of us? No. If you want, it can just be the two of us, or me and you and one of your teammates. But I'd be happy to come and hang out with you and your entire team if that's what you'd like to do. I can listen to some of your material, provide feedback. We can, go over an area of mock trial that you want to know more about. I'd be happy to coach you all up. Really, it's whatever you guys want to do. I would love nothing more than to spend time with you and a teammate, or you and your team. And to set that up, you can click the link in the description on YouTube or in the show notes on podcast platforms. Last topic I want to get into, a few topics within this, but last overarching topic. We've talked about preparing your case. We've talked about practicing as a team. I want to talk a little bit about practicing as an individual, because we always tell our kids, and I feel like we're not very good with this. We say, you need to be working on this outside of practice. You need to be improving yourself outside of practice. But we don't really give them a very good roadmap, I feel like, for that. And I think that's probably a problem with a lot of coaches. There are probably a lot of people listening to this who get that advice and feel frustrated. And it's like, well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to get better? So what's your advice for that person who's listening right now and has the fire and wants to put in the work but doesn't really know where to go or what to do?
Yeah, I think muscle memory and repetition are really important, especially in your first 3 to 4 years as a competitor in either the high school or college bucket. It's really easy when there's high pressure and the lights on, so to speak, to have,
Mm-hmm.
memory errors. I think also movement is something you can definitely play with when you're by yourself. Does it feel really weird when my arms are outstretched this way? Does it feel stranger if I'm a witness leaning forward in a particular way or leaning back? Watching video of your other teammates and, different competitors on YouTube can be really helpful. If you're a witness, practice your direct as a monologue and listen back to it. Do I sound really bored? Is this particularly interesting? Does my accent hold over a number of questions? And if you're an attorney, you can practice with anybody. Grab a sibling, grab your parents, grab anyone who's sitting around, and pull them into that. We have Zoom now too. Record yourself, watch your face. Do you look upset for some reason in this particular part of this opening statement? Is your voice being really quiet? I think there are a lot of tools you can use by yourself, like time yourself too. Do we have timing problems? There are a lot of things you can check for when you're just in the isolation of your own room.
This is something else that there are a lot of varying opinions on. It depends on who you ask. There are a lot of people who've won national titles who would say one thing, a lot of people who've won national titles who would say the other thing, and that is how much, not on speeches so much, but on your direct examinations, your cross-examinations, how much of that should be scripted versus how much of that should be left open for thinking in the moment and reacting off the cuff. I'm curious, especially through the progression of your career through those 8 years, did you change it all with that? The farther you went, did you become less scripted?
It's funny. I think I became more.
Really? See, for me, it was the total opposite. My last college tournament, I literally rolled in there and they told me, all right, you're crossing this witness. And I said, who? And they had to explain, for me, that was more fun because then I got to be a lawyer in my own mind. But I could see how for some people that would be utterly terrifying, that notion.
Yeah, I feel like I got a lot of performance anxiety doing mock trial. I think a lot of people do. And as you do it longer, the pressure, so to speak, of still knowing what you're doing and still making sure you're improving. I think in high school, I rolled in there so much, just off the cuff, no idea what was going on, just the most aggressive attorney you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And in college now, we script cross answers for witnesses. We script everything to the letter. And I think the point is not that you should always be following that script, but that it exists as a roadmap to fall back on when you're not sure about the improvisations you could make. So that if you're never faced with a question where you think to yourself, I have no idea what I'm about to say, you always have something you could say or should say. And if you need to deviate from that, more power to you, go for it. But I don't know. I maybe am overly worried.
I think we just fall on opposite ends of the spectrum. And like I was saying, two successful competitors here, both having completely different strategies. I mean, you mentioned earlier in AMTA in college, you'll get the packet and there's, these 10 witnesses you may wind up crossing. I looked at that and I said, nope, I'm not writing 10 crosses. I'm just going to figure this out when I get there. But I had teammates who were exactly like you who said, no, the opposite is what freaks me out is not having the 10 scripts. And I will ask this, because this was your approach. When you are that scripted, how do you avoid sounding scripted? How do you avoid sounding like this is a performance, like this is recital, like it's a play, versus appearing as if this is all occurring to you in the moment?
That's such a good question. And I think there's no perfect answer for a different competitor, but a lot of the time when I would recite things for myself, I would say it in different ways. I wouldn't recite it the same way
Yeah.
every time. I would do a run really fast, one that was painfully slow, one in an Irish accent, one where, I didn't move my body at all, so that the words became known, but the tone, the intonation, the more dynamic pieces of it didn't. And I don't think that works perfectly for everybody. Frankly, I think you're right. There's a risk that you sound too scripted, for sure. But sometimes too, just really being able to imagine yourself as a quote unquote real attorney or a quote unquote real witness, where you're truly that person in the moment. That spark of inspiration that you get right before the round starts is such a mysterious component to it as well, that it's hard to say practice this way and it won't sound scripted. A part of it is just unknown.
So as someone who likes the scripting, who likes to fall back on the preparation, how in the world did you handle trial by combat? Which, if I understand correctly, you get the case, 24 hours before the first round starts?
Yeah, you do. It is probably terrifying to say that I really did have most of that material memorized, because we wrote really quickly, and we got things down on paper really quickly, so there was more time to memorize and to practice the performance of it. But I think just practicing memorization as a skill makes you better at memorization, right? Like the fact that I was so scripted for so many years meant that for years, all I did was make sure that I had, the exact words stuffed in my head. And it made me better at that with the 24-hour prep. But
of those 24 hours, how much of that was sleep?
Maybe 4 hours the first night, maybe 6 the second night.
You didn't get your script and you didn't get your rest.
I didn't get either, but I did get caffeine, which patched me over for about 2 days.
So I'm curious, did you feel like out of your element when you went in there? And because even in Gladiator, which we both competed at the same Gladiator tournament in high school, we had a month before the tournament. So even though that was a little bit less preparation, trial by combat would have been your first time just totally raw doing it like that.
Yeah. I did it both my junior and senior year. And I think my first year, I definitely fell out of my element and intimidated and worried about the prep period that I'd never tried before. But it's like anything in life. Once you do it a couple times, you become a lot less scared of what it ends up being. And I think that goes for tournaments too. Like your first regionals, I remember being absolutely scared to death.
Yeah.
But by the fourth time around, I'm chatting with the other freshmen going, it's just regionals. We don't need to worry about it that much.
My nerves at my first regionals went away very quickly when the guy who gave the opening statement, we were defense, and so the first guy to speak was opener for the other team, who stands up with gum in his mouth and reads his opening statement. Oh. And at that moment, the nerves went away. It was funny how that worked.
That's true, but how would you have ever known
exactly
before you walked into that courtroom that it was going to be that easy?
Hey, we've got a lot of competitors who did this in high school. Now they're in college. They're adjusting to the differences. What was the biggest change and shift for you leaving high school mock trial, going into college? And how do you handle that shift?
If I only get to pick one,
you're welcome to choose more than one if you'd like.
I do think it was that the evidentiary world opened up to such a larger scale. I did mock trial in California, and there in high school, you get maybe 10 objections that you get to work with.
I had no idea about that. I had Amanda Mundell on the podcast last month, and she told me that. I had no idea that was the way it was.
Yes, and I struggled to know what hearsay was even then, when it was only one of 10 possible objections you could make. And you show up to your first practice in college and they're like, here are 100 objections and rules. And, the stipulations are so much longer. I think it took a while to just get up to speed on the actual studying that was required to bridge that educational knowledge gap that I had. But I think to your earlier question of how do you make up for that difference, it really was just studying. I made flashcards. We, played different games trying to quiz each other on the flashcards. It helped a lot. You'd be surprised how much a set of flashcards can change your mock trial career.
Well, Liz, we're running out of time, and as we wrap up, I want to ask you 2 questions that I ask every guest of the Mock Trial Masterclass podcast, which you're number 2, so that means you're the second person getting asked these questions. A lot of people listening to this content at various stages of their career. There are probably a lot of newbies listening to this. There are probably some people who are seasoned and just looking to, add that next step to their game. But especially for those who are new, this can be an overwhelming activity. It can feel like I am the only person who is dealing with these things that I am dealing with. And so as I talk to the best and the brightest on this podcast, I want to know, number 1, what was your biggest individual victory in mock trial? This could be a moment. It can be an award you won, an accomplishment. But I also want to know, what's the biggest mistake you made? What was your biggest blunder? Something that we maybe can chuckle at a little bit.
Oh, that's such a good question. And you're so right. For anyone feeling nervous, talk to other people on your team, because I'm sure they have hilarious stories about both of these questions. Biggest victory is difficult for me because I mostly tried to measure my competitive success against myself. So the question was more of, am I improving? Am I better at this tournament than I was last tournament? And I think competitors who are really successful, it can start to not feel as good, trying to aim for, awards and trophies near the end, because the expectation is that you do. And if you don't, you've fallen off, your pedestal.
I relate to that 100%.
Yeah. I think Orcs last year, which for those who don't know is the national qualifier for the national championship in college. We at Stanford had been through just an awfully difficult season. We had lost our head coach, and we went 7.5 and a half at that tournament. Okay. And I think it felt really good to have the team victory. It felt really good to have overcome some really difficult obstacles. And it felt good that in my last season, I was going to get one more shot at nationals. And I think that opportunity win was a really big sort of like breath of fresh air. And for all of us who know, Orcs is just the most awful tournament of the whole season. It's incredibly difficult. So it felt really good to have finished that too. And to be done completely with Orcs as a competitor, at least. The mistake is actually, I will never forget how badly I screwed this up.
Oh, I can't wait.
In my life. My freshman year, we flew
college
to a
or high
tournament.
School?
College. Okay. College. I was badly embarrassed. We flew to a tournament called Great Chicago Fire, which is held at the University of Chicago and is a very, very good tournament. And somehow I had been assigned to cross-examine the defendant who had a deposition, which I knew almost nothing about because those didn't exist in high school mock trial.
Yeah.
And I got up on that cross-examination and just could not pin this person down whatsoever. And I think we were hitting U Chicago. And I remember sitting down after like 13 minutes of just absolutely not being able. It was awful, Luke. Just not being able to land a single blow. Just sat down at my chair completely defeated. But it gets worse. Because that round, Regina Campbell, who is, for those who don't know, an incredible competitor and AMTA alumni, stood up on closing argument. And one of the first things she says was 86. And she goes, 86 questions.
Oh my gosh.
Asked the defendant.
No
and 80,
way.
Yes, it was so bad.
Oh my gosh.
I was so embarrassed, but I learned a very good lesson, which is that I really needed to know what the heck I was doing with those deposition witnesses. But it was just incredible to also watch her be able to do her thing. But it was a very big mistake. And I was,
I mean, I'm just impressed that she focused along. I mean, for all we know, she could have very well made up that number. But
it felt true.
I wouldn't have had the focus to sit there and tally for that long. Like, When I was in high school, we used a strategy kind of like that, but it was usually like 20. Like I feel like after question 30, I would have just made up a number at that point.
Whether or not the number was made up, the point was that I had really done a poor job cross-examining that witness. And it's true, I did. But I think it's crazy because that tournament actually ended up going really well. So like your mistakes and your victories always happen to fall so closely to one another in mock trial that for anyone who this happens to, or this has already happened to them, don't worry. Your biggest victories are shortly here coming. Don't worry.
Even Liz Grant gets KO'd by opposing counsel every now and then. This has been so much fun. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's been a while since we were both at Gladiator together.
Yes, that was 2017, I think. So did you do it twice?
Yeah, I did.
What did you place the second time? Or was when we were there together, was that your second time?
Oh, geez. I think 2017 was the first time, and my first time around went much better than my second time. I think I was like, I don't know.
Because I remember you lost to Audrey Shepard in the semifinals.
That is exactly what happened.
Which losing to Audrey Shepard is something that many have done over the over the years.
That's very true. I mean, I hope that there's Gladiator video. Well, not of that year, I guess not. But there's some amazing, incredible video of her that people should definitely go watch because her style is so distinct that it's just such. It is a breath of fresh air to watch her perform because everything she says sounds so new.
A lot of especially the young ladies on the team that I coach, love watching her videos and love taking inspiration from her. And you are great in your own right, Liz. Thanks again for hopping on.
Yeah. Thank you, Luke.